Hey everybody, welcome back to Jägerhorn. It's been quite a while since the last episode, but recently I've been feeling pretty inspired to work on this, and I finally have some time to work on this as well. So, if all goes well, I should be releasing uploads at a slightly better upload rate than I have been doing recently. And if you follow me on Twitter, which you totally should by the way if you're not doing that yet, I'm posting quite a few updates over there as well of what I'm doing in this park, which means that you can see my stuff before it goes up here on YouTube. So yeah, this episode is basically about the transfer track, which I'm not going to talk about too much because I've done some videos on transfer tracks in the past, so I don't think I'll need to explain the concept too much. But there are a few basic things which I kind of want to talk about because essentially what it boils down to is in that almost every single aspect of this transfer track I decided to make it look nice in the first place and then figure out afterwards how to actually make it functionally sound, which made this whole process a little bit complicated even if I'm pretty glad with what the end result looked like. So first of all, the type of transfer track that I'm using here is the type of transfer track where you slide the entire track back and forth with the train on it, which is pretty useful if you don't want to have a bunch of switch tracks of the other type, which is where you have a very small piece of track where you have one part that is straight and one part that is curved, and you switch between these two to get the train on another rail. And the whole point of getting the train on another rail, or transferring the train to another rail, is for one, it is to store tracks or to store trains when you're not using them. So in the case of a multi-train ride like this one, you don't always have to use all of the trains because that's quite expensive, and if it's a very quiet day, you might as well just run one train and get it over with, and when you're doing that you can always store the train in the transfer track. And the other use of a transfer track is sometimes, not always, but very often, just as a general maintenance shed, or just to store them in any case. Because when you're working on the trains or you need to inspect them in the morning or anything like that, it can be quite handy to have a separate area where you can put them. So yeah, in this case, I went for a completely sliding track, which means that there's just one curve leading into this transfer track, and then you can put the train on the track here and slide it to the side on these iron beams, and then bring over the other track and store another train on it. I did a little bit of a brain fart, I suppose, in the fact that there's only 2 tracks. I guess with a lot of work I can actually put 3 tracks in the storage shed here. But what it essentially means is that eventually, because I'm using 3 trains, one of the trains has to stay on the track itself at all times, which is not exactly an ideal situation. Maybe I'll slightly change that in the future, but at least it's acceptable and doable for now. It's just complicated to get around that because I decided, as you might be able to see, I'm already working on the transfer shed, which I'll get into a little bit more in the future, but I decided to have this place in the middle of the park, kind of. Usually, when you have a transfer track on a roller coaster, the park decides to put it somewhere that's kind of out of view, or if you're Universal or Disney, you hide it super well. In some of those parks, I can't even tell where the transfer track is. Because usually the transfer track is something that doesn't look very good, and it's a place which you don't want guests to see in general. So you kind of tend to hide it, and in this case I decided to put it in the middle of the park because I wanted the shed of the transfer track to actually be part of the scenery, to be part of all of these houses which you have over here, to establish an alpine village mood. And this kind of is slightly annoying and challenging because a transfer track, especially the one which I'm using here, is in the first place something which you need for technical reasons. And in this case, it means that we have a bunch of sliding track down there, which means that there's no way to make a building here which is not perfectly rectangular shaped. The transfer track itself is just a rectangular footprint, and there cannot be any pillars in the middle of that footprint because the track needs to slide over there. Which means that making this into a nice looking building, even though that was my intention from the get-go, is kind of challenging because, as anyone who might have some experience in Minecraft might be able to tell you, it's kind of difficult to build a perfectly rectangular boxy building that doesn't look very boring and flat and boring. I shouldn't have said boring twice there, but I guess it gets the point across. Rectangular buildings are really boring, and you generally want to avoid those. There's just no way of getting around that with this transfer track in the middle of my park. And the reason why I'm not hiding it on the side of the park like a Disney or Universal park is partly because I didn't want to do that, because that would make the footprint of Jägerhorn even larger, and I'm trying to cram this whole ride into a as realistically small area as I can, while on the other hand, if I didn't put this building here, I feel this would just kind of be a dead end in the park. Sure, I could put some foliage over here, or maybe some simple terraforming, but that would be kind of boring and wouldn't really give you anything to look at. And with this building over here, I feel it's just something that in the general composition of the park gives you something really nice to look at. Honestly, Jägerhorn is probably the project where I've put most effort into the sightlines and into the general composition of the area out of anything that I've ever done in Planet Coaster. And even with this shed, even though it might seem very randomly placed, I thought about this a lot when it comes to how it would look together with the station building. And so if you're looking from the path that bridges the coaster track and goes toward the station building, you can see this building along with the station kind of in the distance, and I think that they make for a pretty good looking couple that makes the whole area feel a little bit more well-rounded. So yeah, that's why I decided to turn the transfer track into more of a scenery thing in the first place. So yeah, with all of that said, with me wanting to have a transfer track right here for scenery reasons, while at the same time a transfer track is really annoying to turn into a nice looking building because it's perfectly rectangular, but because it's there for scenery reasons I wanted to make it look as good as possible. This whole situation is kind of complicated even to talk about, but what it essentially boils down to is that I wanted to build a shed which is just a pure skeleton of a regular maintenance shed, some pillars on the sides, and then just a flat roof with a lot of beams, just as a sort of structural core to make sure that this thing doesn't collapse onto itself, and then just build all of the roofs in different variations and different shapes with a lot of detailing on top of that to kind of distract you from the fact that this is really, in essence, a perfectly rectangular, very boring storage shed. So yeah, that's why you can see all of the pillars on the side, which are perfectly supporting this building, and you can see the skeleton from the inside, which is just a very boring rectangular skeleton of a building as well. But I'm trying to add as many shapes and details around that to get a nice looking building on the outside. I'm not going to put too much effort into the interior yet, definitely not the interior of the storage track itself, but I do want to put a lot of effort into making sure that the skeleton of this building is realistic, because I wanted to make sure that this would be able to realistically be a decent looking transfer track. Even if that doesn't make a lot of sense from a park perspective, it's something I just really wanted to try in this case. So yeah, with all that said, with the skeleton in place for the building, all that's really left to do is to finish the detailing, do a little bit of interior, not because there's going to be anything up here, but because with this balcony on front you'll be able to look into the building, so I at least want to put a little bit of stuff here as a little bit of an Easter egg. Maybe in the future, I didn't do that in this episode, but it would be fun to maybe at some point add some scenery objects in there, like some barrels or whatever, as something to at least gawk at when you're looking at the building from the outside. But yeah, it's a slightly weird situation, because like I said, usually you have the transfer track in a sort of a hidden area, but in this case I made the decision to really integrate it as much as I could into the scenery of this whole park. Which is also interesting because the building itself, the way it looks from the outside at least, was inspired by typical alpine townhouses that you see throughout the Alps in Europe, those very Tyrolean and Swiss little mountain houses. And that's also why I thought it would be interesting to have these stucco fronts, where even though it's just one stucco wall, and it's not really a building in itself, because I can't really put any walls in the middle of the transfer track, because we have the sliding track there. At least that little arched stucco wall kind of gives you the impression of this building being a regular alpine house. And then all of the varying roof pitches and the wooden pillars that you have on the side give a sense of variation into how the building looks. Now, with that all said, this building is almost finished. I'll be getting back to it a few times in the future, just to add more detail to it again and make it look slightly better. But the rest of this episode is also some detailing when it comes to foliage around the ride itself. And obviously I still need to finish all of the catwalks, because that's something that I started at some point in the past, and now I'm kind of regretting it. But I kind of need to add all of the catwalks around the ride as well, just in case that it stops somewhere along the ride, so that you can evacuate the people and make sure that they walk to the rest of the park, kind of in the same way that people tend to get evacuated on Big Thunder Mountain. Which, God, I'm jealous of people who actually get evacuated on that. It's kind of funny, because sometimes Big Thunder Mountain manages to stall in the middle of the ride and they have to walk down the catwalks that run alongside the track, which for a lot of people is just, you know, something funny in your day, but for a lot of coaster enthusiasts, that is like a big wish. Like, a lot of people really want to get stuck on a roller coaster and get evacuated as if it's some kind of achievement, which I always thought it's funny. I would definitely love to be evacuated one day. Unfortunately, it's never happened to me so far, but it would definitely be a fun experience. At least on this coaster, you can walk your way back into the park. There's a lot of coasters where if you get stuck somewhere midway, it's gonna take a pretty complicated evacuation thing to get everybody out of the ride again. But yeah, that is way off topic. In any case, that's why I decided to have all of the catwalks alongside the ride, which I still have to keep doing every time that there is a section of the ride which doesn't have them yet. There's also a few alpine touches to this building, by the way, which I definitely think do kind of sell the alpine European look. There's again the painted decorations on the side of the walls here. I didn't want to leave the walls completely empty, and I think these sort of swishy, swirly paint decorations add a neat flair to the building. Then there's the little spires on top of the gables, which are really a sort of Swiss chalet kind of addition. The same goes for all of the wooden beams which decorate the gables. Still a big fan of adding those, and with every building that I add, I'm still trying to have some slight variations in the wooden gables. And then there's a large dormer over here, because this area really felt kind of empty, and I felt like adding a dormer here would neatly finish the building when it comes to the composition and add a bit of detail to the roof here. And then of course, there's also all of the flower window boxes, which are just those things that you see all throughout the European Alps, which definitely add a nice natural flair to the building, because as any architect that does any renders probably knows, adding foliage to a building just always makes it look better. And if you add a lot of foliage to your buildings, you might even win a skyscraper award, even though your building doesn't look that great, but it just has a lot of foliage on it. I'm not throwing any shade there, by the way. I do like it. Honestly though, the problem with a lot of architectural renders when it comes to buildings though is that on the renders they'll have a lot of foliage on it, but then in real life the foliage is kind of lackluster. And in a lot of countries, like the Netherlands where they keep trying this thing, these buildings look nice in summer, but then when it's winter and all of the foliage is losing their leaves, it looks kind of mediocre. And then you'd rather wish that all of the attention went to designing the building itself. That's wildly off topic, but I can kind of relate it back to Planet Coaster, because one thing that I always feel is kind of surprising about Planet Coaster is that nobody does any winter coasters. Maybe a few people have done this, but I've rarely seen it. And sure, people make coasters where it's in a snowy biome, but I mean winter as in when it's winter. When a park is running in winter and there's not necessarily any snow, but all of the trees are dead and leafless, and everything just looks generally very different. There's barely any grass, and the grass that is there looks a little bit more colorless. Overall, there's very few colors. I think it's a style which a lot of people don't do because it obviously looks really drab, but with a lot of theme parks in the world being open all year round, yet in winter having very colorless foliage and a very different look altogether, I think a winter park in general could be very interesting in Planet Coaster. And again, I'm not talking about winter in terms of snow. I think plenty of people are trying the snowy biome, but really just winter in terms of how most places that are not in an Arctic climate or a tropical climate look like in winter when there's not any snow. But yeah, that is still a little bit of an off-topic point. It's just something that I think about sometimes, because, you know, this is Planet Coaster, we can basically present the perfect situation, but all Planet Coaster parks, almost all of them, are always perfectly vibrant and saturated, and all of the trees have all of their leaves and everything. It's always sunny and beautiful weather, but most of the times theme parks don't actually look like this. This is a sort of very idealistic image of what a theme park looks like. And that is not really throwing any shade to anybody, really just an idea. I would love to sometimes see some real winter parks or some kind of drab looking parks where it just gives you a cozy winter atmosphere. I think there's some charm to that as well. Being in a park where the weather is kind of bad and all the trees are kind of dead, but it's quiet and you can drink hot chocolate. Sometimes that's really awesome as well. It's about time, by the way, that I start getting on topic again. I don't think I've quite pointed this out yet. This is the second time that I'm recording the commentary, so I think I only pointed it out in the previous time. But the back of the building here is in the sort of standard storage shed style. Normally, if you have a transfer track, this is just usually what you'd see. Just dressing up the skeleton with some very simple and cheap walls and no detailing at all. And that is what I'm doing at the back of this building, just because there will be foliage around here. Plus there are no sight lines here, there's no path anywhere near this, and you're not going to be able to see this. So I don't really see the point in dressing this up all too much. Just keeping the back of the maintenance shed here as simple as I can, just to make sure that realistically I wouldn't have to spend too much money on that. It's also a little bit lower than the rest of the building, so it certainly doesn't draw any attention toward it, and the real focus of the building is really toward the front of it. Now something which I totally forgot to talk about, which I just did a little while ago, is do the other part of the transfer track, because there is one thing which I did need to build to make sure that you can get the coaster train either on the track itself or onto the transfer track, is that little switch track right in front of the station. Usually you see those switch tracks behind the station or at the end of the ride, if you will, but in this case this is really the only place where I could fit it. But that switch track is really just the more standard type of switch track, and what you typically see on mine train coasters as well, where there's just one small straight piece of track and one curved one, and you switch between these two to lead the coaster train down two different paths. Usually it switches horizontally like this. Sometimes they actually have a rotating one where both tracks are on the bottom of each other and it's kind of like flipping a coin. But yeah, there's a bunch of variations on this, but this is just the one that fits best in here, and the only one that I honestly had the space to build. And the rest of this is just kind of finishing the last little details on the shed, adding some foliage around it, and also finishing that little lake that we've got going in the middle of this whole area, which I think is shaping up to be a pretty good part for some sightlines as well. I'm trying to keep the sightlines in mind as much as possible throughout the building of this whole ride, and one of my favorite sightlines is honestly from the catwalks of that little lake. You only see it for a fraction of a second if you're on the ride itself, because even though it curves around that sightline, you'd obviously have to tilt your head quite a bit to see the view. But I still think it's a really cool view, and something which would look really great if you do manage to look that way if you're on the coaster, because it is that one view where all the bridges line up, where you can see the station as well as the church in the distance, and hence why I decided to have a lake there, just to make sure that that sightline is intact. Because if there were just regular foliage and trees over there, you would definitely not be able to have that sightline. So yeah, sometimes I go for a feature in the landscape just to make sure that you can see something else from some other place, which I think works out in some cases. In any case, for Jägerhorn, the sightlines are some of the most important parts of the park. Now finally, I wanted to round up this episode by finishing this wall of foliage on the side of the track here, just to make sure that you don't see the edge of the park and you don't see that wooden fence that separates the park from the staff area. And that is basically it for this episode, and that is the transfer track and its surroundings finished. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.